It's my real honour to be able to facilitate the Q&A this morning. I come from a physical sciences background, so I don't know much about anything else. But lately I've been getting into reading about soils. And so I'm really excited to hear what you've got to do, although you'll be talking not just about the soils, but the trees and the plants that come from them. So Tony Rinaudo is also known as the Forest Maker, and he's a Principal Climate Action Advisor at World Vision Australia and a Fellow of ISCAST. And he's known for his pioneering Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration, FMNR, which is a method that restores degraded landscapes without planting trees. FMNR has revolutionised reforestation across Africa and beyond. And so Claire already has given a spook for Tony's excellent book, which won the 2022 Christian Book of the Year award. The title of the book is The Forest Underground, Hope for a Planet in Crisis. And Tony's going to give us a talk now entitled Climate Change and Faith, what we can do and why should we do it. And we'll have a bit of a Q&A afterwards. So thank you, Tony.
Yeah, thank you, Felicity and Claire. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank ISCAST for organising, hosting this event, and yeah, very happy to share with you. Jackie asked me to share a little bit of my story, how I got to be doing this tree work. Give tips on what we can do as individuals about climate change and the intersection between faith and action on environment. So I grew up in a very beautiful part of Victoria, Myrtleford. I don't know if any of you, usually people pass through Myrtleford to get to Bright or the snow country, but for me it was very idyllic childhood. I walked over many of those hills, climbed some of the trees with a little band of boys from the end of our street, and swam in the rivers. We fished there. And I just loved God's creation, loved engaging in it. And we had a wonderful childhood. But there were probably three significant things that shaped me and formed the person that I am to this day. That bushland that I loved so much was being bulldozed. And even as a child, I didn't understand ecology, but the way we were using or abusing land didn't make sense. That for short-term gain, we would destroy the natural resources for future generations. And I could see the loss of biodiversity, bare steep hills exposed to the weather, so there was lots of erosion, and they were left fallow like that for years on end. The main crop in Myrtleford at that time was tobacco, and they used to spray DDT and other chemicals from aeroplanes, and the drift would go into those rivers that we drank from and swam in. And sometimes there'd be fish kills, great big trout would float downstream belly up right past you as you're swimming. These things had a very big impact on me. And I wondered, why did it really have to be that way? The other significant thing was I was curious about the world, and I'd watch the news, I'd read things that I could get my hands on. And I realized that while we had the luxury of growing tobacco in our area, other children were less fortunate, and they were going to bed hungry through no fault of their own. And the injustice of that, the stupidity of that just didn't make sense to me. And I think I was quite an angry boy, felt frustrated, but powerless. How could I change the adult world? What did I know anyway? But the third thing that influenced me was my mum's faith. And it gave, I think, a framework for living, that there are more important things to life than just financial security, that we are our brother's keeper. We've got a responsibility for those less fortunate than ourselves. And thirdly, we have a duty of care for God's creation. It's very clear in Scripture, and I'll share just a few verses a little bit later on in the talk. So as a child, what to do? I did the one thing that I felt I could do, and I threw up a child's prayer. Please, God, use me somehow, somewhere to make a difference. And I've tried to be true to that prayer all my life, and I believe in many ways God's honoured that prayer. Long story short, I studied agriculture at university. I thought I'd better have a skill behind me if I'm going to be useful. That's where I met Liz. And often I'm called the forest maker, but I think it should be the forest makers. It's very much a team effort. We have the same vision right from when we met at university, and we've been through the hard times together and the triumphs together. And so it's really not fair that I'm up here speaking alone and I get the awards and the recognition, but it's a team effort. We joined a missionary organization serving in mission, and were given an assignment in Niger Republic, West Africa. So a little bit of context: landlocked country, borderland of the Sahara Desert. Regularly, every year, there's a UN index on human development. Every year, Niger Republic is in the bottom 10 poorest countries of the world. Sometimes the very bottom, but certainly less than fifth from the bottom every year. So very, very poor country, and suffering from the effects of climate change and from massive deforestation. As populations grew, there was a need for more farmland, and people cleared land in order to grow food. And there we were, just barely new graduates, no experience, and we're confronted with this. A landscape at the point of ecological collapse, barely able to support life, even though within my short lifetime at that time, we were in our early 20s, this had been a biodiverse dryland forest with patches of productive farmland here and there, with springs occasionally, even wildlife. In 20 short years, it had been reduced to this. At that time in the 80s, we didn't know so much about climate change. There were a few headlines, but I didn't take much notice of it at that time. There wasn't a lot of information, not that I was aware of. What I was aware of was the deforestation going on, and these things have consequences. We were experiencing increased frequency and severity of drought. Wind speeds at planting time of 70 kilometers per hour would sandblast the little plants as they were emerging, or bury them outright. And farmers would plant and replant. Each time it would get wiped out. They didn't have a magic pot of seed to get that seed from. This was their food supply. And I often think about the mental trauma of a parent going out, dutifully planting that seed again and again and again, knowing full well that each time they planted, there was less food in the pot for their children. Very hard choices that people had to make. Without tree cover, soil surface temperatures could exceed 60 degrees Celsius. So it's just baking there. And as the plants emerge, as they germinate, they're already weakened. They're already more vulnerable to insect and pest attack. Even if it rained, and it did rain some years, even if it rained, because the biodiversity had been removed, there were no checks and balances, no insect-eating birds, spiders, lizards, and so on. And so you'd have this great population explosion of locusts, caterpillars, various kinds of sap-sucking insects. Even in a so-called good year, there was no guarantee of people having enough to eat. And people were regularly hungry. We were involved in famine relief 5 separate years. So very, very difficult context that we were living in. And it seemed to fly in the face of this biblical idea of abundance. God's given us everything that we need for life, for our physical needs. And often I thought maybe God's forgotten about Niger. Might be true in Australia or US and other places, but what about Niger? This verse, did you have Niger in mind when you wrote this verse? It didn't seem to apply here. And one morning I read this verse, Psalm 104 verse 30, when you send your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the earth. So I read this in my morning quiet time. I thought, oh, that's interesting. And I sort of left it at that. I didn't really delve into it. But later on that day, I was driving to the villages and I stopped on this bare patch of ground. And I was doing the sums. What would it take to restore land like this? It used to be a forest. Maybe it's beyond redemption. It certainly cost a lot of money, a lot of effort, maybe some geoengineering, helping the water to soak in and so on. But I thought with the resources we have, we could never restore that. There'd been a light rain the day before, and I looked down at my feet, and there was a little plant germinating in a crack. And I remembered that verse. And it occurred to me, God's not only in the business of saving souls and healing broken humanity, God's also in the business of healing the broken earth, recreating and healing the earth. Now, I think that's a very, very important message. We don't often hear it in Sunday services, but God's vitally interested in this beautiful creation that he put us in. And so that gave me a little bit of courage, but I was still left with the problem, what to do. And I thought, if deforestation was one of the major root causes of all these issues, hunger, crop failure, insect attacks, and all this. If deforestation was one of the root causes, then surely reforestation, planting trees, getting them back out in the field, that'd have to make up for a big part of the solution. And when you're young, you're convinced that you're invincible, you can solve the world's problems yesterday. It just wasn't happening. And I threw everything at it. I studied any text I could get on replanting trees in this Sahel region. I grabbed any consultant, any expert I could find and plied them with questions. I experimented different seed, different species, different methods, different timing. Nothing worked in a satisfying or economically viable way. I mean, you could do it if you had enough millions of dollars to do it, but nobody's going to maintain that kind of investment in this landscape. And at that age, it's very easy to get discouraged. There's total waste of time and money, not having any impact. People back home, rather selfishly thinking people back home getting on with their life, and here I am scratching around in the dirt. What am I doing? Maybe I didn't really hear God's voice. Maybe I made a big mistake. And to add insult to injury, the very people who we went to help called me the crazy white farmer. Who in their right mind would devote valuable farmland to tree planting of all things? Tony, I'm hungry today. I can't wait 15 or 20 years for a tree to bear fruit or whatever. So it did seem crazy to them, and understandably so. They really were hungry quite often. But in my mind, I was very convinced there could be no viable agriculture in this landscape, in this climate, without some level of tree cover to protect the soil and the crops, to fertilize the soil. People didn't have funding, they didn't have access to modern inputs. Even just to fertilize the soil, you needed trees. So I knew that we were on the right track, we're just doing it the wrong way. It wasn't working what we were doing. You can get an inkling of my frustration. Look at the landscape behind that nursery there. And as far as you could travel in any direction, it was similar to that. And so there I was, young, full of energy, full of initiative to try and do something, but totally failing. And this would have been one of those days when it would have been quite easy to give up and go home. But I thought, no. And I remembered that child's prayer, use me somehow, somewhere to make a difference. And I thought, God doesn't make mistakes. There must be a solution. And so again, I turned to prayer, firstly asking God to forgive us. And again, I think this is a very, very important message for us in the age of climate change. Forgive us for destroying the gift of your creation. And as a consequence of this, people are suffering. They're hungry, they're poor, they're fearful for tomorrow. They don't know what's going to hit them the next day. But you love us. You sent your son to die for us. Help us. Show us what to do. Open our eyes. And I didn't plan to talk about that forgiveness prayer in terms of climate change, but just off the top of my head, people are suffering. The consequences of our consumption, of our emissions, people around the world are suffering. And certainly the hardest hit are the most vulnerable, the poorest, but it's hitting Western countries too. We can't ignore our responsibility. But in terms of this, it amazed me. I'd been traveling on this track for 2.5 years, nearly every week, eyes wide open, but totally blind to what had been there the whole time. And as an Australian, I should have known. Everybody's seen what happens after bushfire and the gum trees sprout prolifically, or after you cut a eucalyptus tree, all this coppicing, all these shoots come up. I should have known, but I was blind for 2.5 years. And on this particular day, I'm letting the air pressure down so I don't get bogged in the sandy track. And this bush, what I thought was a bush, caught my attention. And I took the trouble to walk over and take a closer look. And immediately, when you look at the shape of the leaf of any plant, have a look at after this session, any plant, it'll tell you what that plant is. It's a signature. And so I realized it's not a weed, it's not a bush, this is a tree. And from my travels during that 2.5 years, I knew there were millions of trees strewn across that landscape, but they're underground. They'd been cut, but they hadn't died, and they were resprouting every year. Normal farming practice. A good farmer is a clean farmer. They slash the regrowth, they burn it so that the ash should give some fertility back to the soil, But as a newcomer, a visitor to the landscape, I wasn't seeing what the land was telling me. There were millions of these trees. And in that moment, everything changed. This wasn't a technological problem. I didn't need a miracle species of tree to withstand goat and droughts and even people pulling them up. Everything I needed was at my feet. And if it was people's false beliefs about the value of trees on their land and negative attitudes, seeing them as weeds, as a nuisance to be cut and ploughed over and gotten out of the way, and if it was people's destructive practices that destroyed what had been biodiverse natural forest, then that's where the battle lines were, not with the Sahara Desert, but with what was going on up here. And my whole approach shifted. This was a social problem, a beliefs problem. And if I could convince parents and communities, it's in your best interest. You'll have a better future for yourselves and your children if you work with nature instead of destroying it. Sure, you can't have a dense forest if you want to grow food, but if we have some trees come back into this landscape, you'll be able to create that future that you want for yourselves and your children. And that was the start of a revolution. I call it the underground forest because if we had special goggles and we could see into the depths of the soil, we'd realize that when you cut a tree down, it's not the end of the story. For most species, certainly not for our gums. 50% of the tree is still alive, and it's got this enormous root system accessing deep moisture, nutrients, stored sugars. And I like to compare it to having a V8 engine. We've turned the motor on, but the vehicle's in neutral and it's bubbling away, trying to get moving. But until you put it in gear, it's stationary. We've got these latent trees, millions and millions of them across continents, not just Niger, not just Africa, but across continents, waiting, eager and ready to regrow if we'd let them. What's involved in putting it in gear? Change behaviours. Can we alter the way we use or misuse livestock, fire, ploughing, and removal of woody biomass? If we can change those 4 behaviours, then the trees will do what they were created to do. They'll care for themselves. Nature's got enormous ability to self-heal. God's built that into creation if we allow it. And so we started to experiment. Knowing what to do is one thing, knowing how to do it is another. Remembering they called me the crazy white farmer who wants trees on their own land. And I thought, I have to be really careful how I approach this because it could fail before it leaves the shed. And I asked for volunteers, about 10 volunteers in as many villages. And I said, I think this will work. Would you be willing to experiment with me? Not on your whole land. Remember, poor farmers are by default, they're risk averse. And if there's any risk of them having even lower yields than what they're already getting, they're not going to be in it. Can we experiment on a small corner of your land and see what happens? And after 1 year, if you like it, we can take it another year and see where that takes us. But it's your land, they're your trees. If you don't like it, heaven forbid, cut them out. There's nothing lost. Hoping the whole time that it would be convincing enough in that first year that people would continue. And the impact was revolutionary. Skipping a bit of a story to stay in the timeline, there were a lot of ups and downs and hiccups along the way, but that was a revolution in the making. And over the following 20 years, landscapes that sported less than 4 trees per hectare, and you can see the black dots there from the satellite image, a lot of hectares there of no trees whatsoever. Over the next 20 years, tree density increased to 40 trees per hectare on many farms, 200 million trees across 5 million hectares without planting a single tree. And to say, I don't use that word revolutionary lightly. In the 15 years prior to the discovery of the underground forest, millions and millions of dollars had been spent on reforestation in this region. One study said that $60 million had resulted in 20,000 hectares of very poor plantations. If you do the maths, if I've remembered the right figures, it's $8,000 per hectare. Now, there's 300 million hectares across the Sahel. Nobody's going to invest several $1 trillion to restore the whole of the landscape. in the 20 years that it took to regenerate 200 million trees, we estimate, because once you release this idea, it's really just an idea. It spreads on its own without any further investment. That 5 million hectares costs less than $2 per hectare. If I had to put a dollar figure on a project cost, what's the actual cost of the project? Less than $50 per hectare. So it was revolutionary. And I've had the privilege of going back from time to time. The last visit was just before COVID, 2019. And people are maintaining it. It's sustainable because it doesn't require ongoing external inputs and support from government or NGOs. People do it as a normal course of their farming practices. Just as you don't tell farmers when and what to plant, you don't have to tell farmers in Niger why they should be doing this. And I was just so thrilled. While there are new challenges, population growth, extremism, there are new challenges in Niger. What had been this downward spiral of degradation, poverty, and hopelessness had reversed, and farmers are growing more and different types of crops and livestock. They're more resilient. Yes, droughts still come, but because of that improved microclimate and the alternative income sources they now have, they're resilient. They can stand up in the face of those climatic shocks. And so we had this upward spiral of restoration, relative poverty, and the restoration of hope. And if you gave me a choice, Tony, what's most significant, the treescape or this restoration of hope? It's the hope. It's powerful. People who have hope will do that. They will think about the future. They'll invest in improvements on their land. They'll send their kids to school. They'll get up in the morning, and instead of saying it's not even worth trying, I've tried everything before and it failed each time, they'll try and try again until they do succeed because they have hope. The hope aspect of this transformation is the biggest impact. And so I joined World Vision in 1999, and it gave me a bigger platform. World Vision works in 100 countries around the world. All of them are impacted by deforestation to one degree or another. And that affects children, that affects poverty. And I thought, wonderful, let me out there. And one of the turning points was this project in southern Ethiopia. So the Niger context was agricultural land. This is a biodiverse natural forest, 2,700 hectares of biodiverse regenerating trees. And again, it had a very big impact, perhaps a surprising and unexpected impact. This area, World Vision had entered there in 1984. So the same famine and drought that we had in Niger occurred right across the Sahel. And a lot of people starved that year. World Vision entered that year and saved many lives through food relief. And then we went into a transition phase, helping people to get re-established, and then a development phase, building schools and clinics and helping with agriculture and so on. Despite our best efforts, to one degree or another, every year for 20 years, World Vision was still giving out food aid, sometimes more, sometimes less. And I joined in 1999. I was baffled because you can see its conditions so much better than in Niger. We'd omitted to address one of the underlying root causes of the problem, environmental degradation. And so when it did rain and the water hit that bare hill up there, it flooded, destroying their crops, making it impossible to plant for a whole growing season. And when there was a drought, there was no backup. People were completely destitute, so nothing to fall back on in the forest. Within 6 years of restoring the forest through FMNR, Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration, this historically food aid dependent community sold 104 tons of grain to the World Food Programme. And even I was surprised. I said, how does that happen? It's not even on your farmland. And they said, Mr. Tony, when that hill got reforested in the wet years, it stopped flooding. And so all that World Vision messaging about fertilizers and better seed and better methods, the risk in farming was gone. We were now willing to invest in it, and we've got bumper yields. And in the drought years, when those clouds hit our forested mountain, they're more likely to drop their rain on our farmland than on the distant neighbours. It's like a magnet attracting the rain. And yes, it might be less rain than we would like in a drought year, but it's more effective. It's cooler here. There's less wind. There's more organic matter in the soil holding onto that moisture. And so it had just totally changed the microclimate, the economy, and the social aspect of life in that region. And it rehydrated the landscape. Springs have come back that had dried up for years on end. The wildlife, I don't know who told them or how they got there. You can see the isolation of the forest, but they got there. And life come back into that community. In addition, this happens to be climate carbon trading project. As the communities grow those trees, they get credits, they get income from selling the carbon stored in the forest. And over a 10-year period, I think it's 110,000 tons of carbon dioxide sequestered into the forest. And the forest sustainably managed now, so that that's locked in there for the long term and increasing year by year as the trees grow. And the potential for this across the world is simply enormous. We're at a really critical point in history where the effects of climate change are starting to bite very, very significantly. People are already suffering. Unfortunately, more people are going to suffer into the future. But I have hope for a number of reasons, but I have hope. Yes, we have to definitely stop emissions as quickly as possible, but at the same time, there are nature-based solutions that we can work on. And I love this graph. I don't know if anybody has read the Weathermakers by Tim Flannery, but when he saw that graph there, the Keeling curve, he said it's the most beautiful diagram I've ever seen, because in it you can see the earth breathing, and the distinctive sawtooth shape of it in the dips, that corresponds with the spring and the summer, when the northern forests are waking up and they're actively sequestering CO2 from the atmosphere. Now, if the forests in the north can have that kind of impact where they put a dent in CO2 levels, and you think for some of those forests, they're only working for 4 months of the year and at a very, very low rate because it's cold, they have limited capacity to draw down CO2. Imagine if we concentrated efforts on restoration across this middle belt where very often you could have carbon being drawn down 12 months of the year at a very high rate because of the temperature and the humidity. Now, it's not the solution to climate change, but by some estimates, if we restored 1 billion hectares of forest, we could draw down anything between 16 and 25% of existing greenhouse gases. So it can make a very big contribution. And I like to say about FMNR, and I'd say tree planting in general, it's a no regrets technology. Nobody in 40 years, nobody's ever come to Tony and said, Tony, you ruined my land, you ruined my life. Nobody. Only thank you, only blessing. And if there was a problem, heaven forbid, we could always cut that forest down again. And I thought I put a slide there, but from World Vision's part, we're working in support of the UN Decade on ecosystem restoration, and their overarching goal is to restore 1 billion hectares of land. And so we're working very, very hard to contribute to that. We'll make our own organizational contribution, but we share the information freely. We encourage others to get on board, either with us or do it alone. It doesn't matter. There's no intellectual property rights on this method. Please just do it. And some people say, well, with a growing population, we need that land for growing food. Crop yields in Niger doubled. It's having the right trees managed the right way at the right spacing. Some areas will never be agricultural land, and they're quite suitable for forest restoration. Many, many areas are degraded agricultural and pastoral land that can support some level of tree cover. So it's not an either or. Will we beat climate change and starve? No, it goes together. I was asked to suggest practical ways to fight climate change. Jackie, I'm not going to do that. If you Google, after 5 minutes, you'll have a lifetime of things to do to fight climate change. So, but what I will do, I think it's a matter of choice. And it's the same choice that I give farmers when I talk to them about, will you adopt FMNR? What's important to you? What future do you want for yourself and your children? Do you want a climate-safe future, and what are you prepared to do about it? I think those are more important questions. The answers on what to do, they're there if you look for them, if you're really concerned. I get to speak a lot around the world, and I meet a lot of young people, and it makes me sad. So many people, young people, are despairing. They think it's too late to do anything about climate change. We're all toasted already. It's too late. I just want to encourage you. It's never too late. And there's a lovely quote from John Maxwell, Christian speaker and author, and he said, "Hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage." Anger at the way things are. And I remember as a little boy, I was angry. They were destroying God's creation. Anger, but courage to get up and do something about it within your gifting, within your interest. We don't have to save the whole world, but God's given us gifts and passions and interests for a reason. For goodness sakes, if you really are angry, have the courage to follow what God's put in your heart. Hope doesn't fall out of the sky. It's not happens by coincidence. You make hope happen by what you do. And I think God's gifted all of us. Maybe you won't go out and plant trees in the desert, but he's gifted all of us to do something. How does faith integrate with caring for the environment? I just want to share four things. So creation's important to God, and if it's important to God, it should be important to us. And there's so many verses. I just picked a few here. And God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very good. Nature, creation has intrinsic value in its own right. As Christians, if we honor God, we need to honor his creation. Yes, use it. Yes, benefit from it. But we have a duty of care to use it sustainably and wisely. And I love those verses from Job and from Proverbs. What was going through God's mind at the time of creation? What was God feeling? Look at the words there. Rejoicing, delighting, angels shouting for joy. And when I preach tomorrow, I did the maths. 10,000 times 10,000 angels up there. 1,000 MCGs full of angels shouting. Can you imagine the din? It wasn't a sedate English morning tea party. It was the end of football season, foot stomping, back slapping party. There's so much joy in heaven. And if I think about what's God feel now when he looks at the state of creation and what we've done to the climate and to biodiversity and so on, God must be very, very sad. If the creation is important to God, as Christians, it must be important to us. Secondly, we're actually commanded, it's not just a nice sentiment, we're actually commanded to care for creation. We are stewards. Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to work it and to take care of it. I think a lot of us have the idea, the first part of it, we work it, we use it, we benefit, and forget the second part. We're actually commanded to take care of it. Thirdly, there's a specific judgment. Do we need a warning? Do we need to know there's a judgment? I can't remember if I've ever heard a sermon on this, but there's actually a verse that says those who destroy the earth will be judged. There's an accountability for how we treat God's creation. Fourthly, and I think this is probably one of the stronger arguments, we're commanded to love our neighbour. And one of the ways that we can love our neighbours is by not contributing to climate change, because people are really suffering already. More people will suffer. And we can contribute to restoring degraded landscapes. This affects people directly, their ability to grow food, their ability to have an income, to send their children to school, to care for them properly. If we really love our neighbour, we have to love God's creation. And finally, I don't know how I'm doing for time, but it's just such a joyful experience when I get to go back into the communities that have adopted this. There's such overwhelming joy, and the kind of impression you get, they're clapping, they're dancing, they're shouting. And it reminds me of that time of creation when there's so much rejoicing and delighting in heaven. I thought, oh, goodness me, when we work with God's creation, we get a foretaste of what life's like in heaven. So thank you.
Thank you, Tony. I really appreciated your talk. And also, yeah, I think sometimes we can think of ourselves as being separate from creation, but we're part of it. And so everything that we do impacts the world around us, and hence everyone else who lives off the land. So yeah, it was a really beautiful confusion with the call to love. And we might start right at the top. Tony, what's the difference between FMNR on communal land and closing up an area for natural or unmanaged regeneration?
So very similar. I'd just say there's a higher level of activity when you're managing. So the words, I didn't create that term, farmer managed, but it's very, very appropriate. So you're actively selecting the trees that you want to regrow, and it'll differ. On farmland, there'll be certain species that just aren't complementary to growing food. So you'll select the trees that you want. You'll manage them by, when you cut a tree, there are many, many stems, maybe 20 or 30 stems that come up from that stump. So you need to reduce the competition. So there's active pruning, reducing some of the lower branches, and then managing it by altering the way we have used fire, graze animals, when and how we collect woody biomass, and ploughing. So within natural regeneration, it's pretty much keep out and let nature heal itself, which it works and it's good, but through active involvement, you can speed the process up and you can direct the shape of that restoration appropriate for the context. Is it farmland? Is it grazing land? Or do we want a natural biodiverse forest?
You mentioned that the most important part of restoring nature was to change attitudes. How can we change the attitudes of those who have no financial incentive to change? Or indeed, whose financial incentive is to not change?
Yeah, great question. And firstly, I'd like to say I don't think I change people's attitudes. I try to work alongside them so that they change their own attitude. And I do that largely through posing questions. And I start with what I call the past, present, future exercise. And the first question is, what was the environment like when you were a child? And I've asked this question in maybe 30 countries. And almost universally, people have wonderful memories. The river flowed all year. The soil was fertile. The rainfall was dependable. There were wildlife. As kids, we used to climb in the trees. There aren't any trees anymore. So they'd have this wonderful picture. And then I ask, what about today? What's the environment like today? And they say, oh, Mr. Tony, it's terrible. The springs have dried up. The farms are depleted. We don't get enough food anymore. Can never rely on the rainfall. All the wildlife have disappeared, and so on and so forth. Very, very difficult for people. And then I twist the knife and I say, if we continue business as usual, destroying nature, destroying the trees, what will life be like for your children? And they know perfectly well, maybe not very many of them in the context I work in, not many have been to school, but these are very, very intelligent, hardworking people, and they know full well things will only get worse. And I've had such terrible responses. It will be hell on earth. We will have to leave everything that we know and love, our ancestral land, our inheritance, and go to the capital city. And that opens the door, and I say, wow, nobody wants to go there, do they? Would you come on a journey with me? I think this will work. Let's experiment just on a small corner of your land. So very deliberately, I'm not changing attitudes directly, and I'm empowering people. I haven't said this is what we're going to do. It's an experiment. We've all got equal say in the outcomes. We're all learning. I'm not telling you what the outcome will be, because honestly, in every context that I go into, I'm scared because I don't know if it'll work there, but I think it will, and we'll learn together. And if you have that approach, then it's much more palatable, I think. I've just come back from visiting 5 European countries. The most common question I received was, isn't that a bit colonialistic, the white fella going in there and changing people? And I thought, no, you've completely misread the situation. I'm there by invitation, and we're learning together. Was there a second half to that question?
No.
Yeah,
That's
thank you.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a journey, and I still, to this day, I still learn as much as I teach when I go to these places.
Thank you. That reminds me a little bit. I'm reading a couple of essays by Wendell Berry at the moment, who talks about this challenge to be on land and to work with it. And I mean, I won't go on, but so another question here is, what is your view of the state of agriculture in Australia at the moment?
So I'm not as familiar with the Australian scene, and I know there's been tremendous uptake in regenerative agriculture, where you're working more in line with natural processes. A big upswing in what's called conservation agriculture, where you minimize the ploughing and breaking up of the soil, and you try to keep crop residues, the straw, keep it on top. Certain farmers are doing more agroforestry than in the past. As I fly over Australia, though, it appears to me that much land is still being abused, that every square inch of that paddock is being ploughed. There's very, very little biodiversity, and I think we're very vulnerable to climate change. We're seeing that with the current flooding, with the previous droughts, excessive temperatures, and I would argue strongly that while FMNR and other nature-based solutions might not look the same here as they do in a developing country, we need to start accommodating more of this here. Do we really have to clear every tree right up to the crest of the hill and to the very edge of the stream? What about the fence lines? Can't we accommodate more trees, more diversity in our fields? Yes, we have mechanization. Yes, we have high labor costs, but we're also intelligent enough to do things smarter than what we have in the past.
Thank you. The next question is there a way that we can continue population growth and still restore the environment? And from a Christian perspective, population growth is a good thing. Yeah.
So this is a prickly one. And I would say off the top of my head that there's enough to go around, and the world could actually accommodate many, many more people, but there's not enough for the world's greed and waste and just the way we go about business. And it concerns me. I got to go back to Niger in 2019, and there are children everywhere. And I thought every landscape has a carrying capacity. If you go beyond that, no matter what you do, how much you improve it, it's not going to feed even more and more people. So it's a very big concern. And I feel the current way we treat the environment and abuse resources, it's not viable to keep growing in that way. So a plea, I think, for sustainability, for more family planning. It's hard to, you can't dictate to other people how many children they should have. Often they simply don't have the information or even the choice. And particularly when girls are educated and when they're given those opportunities, population growth goes down by itself.
So I guess that leads a little bit on to, you mentioned a little bit in your answer there about the difference between agricultural land versus closing off land and keeping it unmanaged. So the question here is, what is the difference between FMNR on communal land and closing up an area for natural unmanaged regeneration?
Yeah, so, Ethiopia, they claim to have about 3 million hectares of land locked up. They're called exclosure zones, and it's touted as a great success. In reality, the trees are really struggling. They're diseased, they're unmanaged, they're more fire prone, and they're surrounded by very, very desperately poor people who go in there when nobody's looking. They go in there anyway. And so outside of, say, national parks, I don't advocate for just locking land up, especially if historically people relied on that land for their livings. Now, they can benefit greatly from learning how to manage it sustainably, but in my mind, it's the wrong approach to lock people out. The environment will benefit and the people will benefit if they work with it in the right way. And in the forest project that I showed there, the satellite image of the forest project in Ethiopia, 2,700 hectares managed by 7 communities. They have full access right. They've agreed, because they receive carbon payments, they've agreed not to chop the trees down outright, but they have every right to collect fuel wood, fodder, wild foods, and so many other benefits from that regenerated area. So I think it's counterproductive. It gives the opposite effect of what people lock land up for, looking for.
You mentioned there about national parks, and I guess if you look in Australia's history for tens of thousands of years, the land, even in areas of significant conservation and biodiversity value, would have been actively managed by Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. What are your thoughts then on even in managing, even in well, I mean, especially with the fire risk?
Yes, so we're paying for it now that they're not managed, and I guess there's a Western idea of pristine areas that supposedly never have people. I don't know that there's anywhere on Earth that never had people. They were managed to some degree in some form at some time, and this is a great example where the Aboriginal people for centuries managed our landscapes by fire stick burning. And so, yeah, maybe I should retract that earlier statement and people in national parks in the right context with the right approach. I think there is a place for both.
Sorry, I was being a bit cheeky with that question. I'm going to ask one question, then I'm going to open it up for some who may not have mobile phones or other technological questions. So if you want to stick your hand up, I'll come to you next, and we'll ask this one first. So do you agree with David Attenborough's argument in his recent biographical documentary about the necessity of rewilding throughout the world?
So is there any context to that? What does he mean by that? Is it locking land up, or?
Yeah, I guess
is it a European thing where they're bringing back wolves and various species that are locally extinct?
Maybe that. Yeah, I actually haven't seen the documentary.
Well, I think it's wonderful. It causes a lot of controversy. Nobody wants to be next door to wolves, but it brings back balance. And so that fire vulnerability, often we've removed the predators, and you get an overpopulation of, in Europe's case, deer. And there's no new trees coming up. They get nibbled off as soon as they germinate. And yeah, it's just out of balance. So in the right context, I think rewilding is good. It's good for biodiversity. It's good for ecosystems.
Yeah, I think there was a really great example of that with Yellowstone as well, where we're introducing wolves, killed off the elk, allowed the aspen to grow, and then you didn't get degradation of the rivers.
Yeah.
And
apparently even changed the course of the stream. It was flowing in a much more healthy way and so on.
Yeah. Do we have any questions from the room? I'll come down.
Thank you, Tony. I've been inspired. I don't know what to do, but I've been inspired. Yes, I was just wondering what threats there might be to your to the enterprise of
for FMNR.
FMNR. Yeah.
On a local level, those things that I mentioned, fire, livestock cutting, it's a constant threat because people not in the program might see that as an opportunity and destroy it. Ideally, we work with all stakeholders and try to bring everyone on board so that this is a shared goal and everybody realizes working with nature, we all benefit, we're all better off. It's even reduced conflict in many cases because there's a lot more to share now, don't have to compete for scarce resources. On another level, what I do is really simple and low cost compared to other methods, and it flies in the face of common wisdom that, you know, if you have a long-standing complex problem like desertification or climate change, it must need a very complex, expensive, sophisticated solution. And so a lot of people don't immediately see the value of what I do. And much of my work now is actually as a spokesperson. I do less hands-on project work, and I advocate, I create awareness and so on, just trying to break down those false impressions. Vested interests. So in some communities, you might have powerful people from the outside. They've traditionally had the grazing dominance there, and they don't want the status quo to change. And so that's a problem in some areas. Yeah.
I might ask one more from online. So we know that the soil is incredibly important for revegetation, and fungi, for example, are really, really important in transporting nutrients, water, even chemical signals from one tree species to another to ward off predators. So this question is curious about the soil. So if there have been any studies that have been conducted looking at the microbiome within the soil pre and post growth with FMNR.
It's absolutely amazing. Most studies that I'm aware of come from Senegal in West Africa. And for starters, if you have that hot baked sand over the length of the dry season, which can be 8 months or more, microbes die off. And when the rains do come, it takes them a long time to kickstart to breed up to any decent numbers. When you have trees there, firstly, it's cooler. Secondly, the roots are exuding sugars, keeping that biodiversity, the microbes alive for the whole length of the dry season. The other thing is that many of these species are actually leaking moisture as well. And so again, it's keeping the microbes alive, but it has a very dramatic effect in the rainy season, especially noticeable if there's a drought. And you get this halo effect. The closer you get to the tree, the healthier and greener and taller the crop is. And it's counterintuitive. You think, oh, the tree should be competing with the crop. Actually, the tree is irrigating the crop. In not every species, I don't think our gum trees will do that, but fortunately the species that we have in Africa, the ones that farmers chose to regenerate, are bio-irrigating the crop and at the same time keeping those microbes alive. I won't go into it all, but there's microbes that put nitrogen into a plant available form. Nitrogen is a really critical nutrient for plant growth. And in the soils of West Africa, phosphorus, another critical nutrient, is very, very scarce. And these fungi will seek out, they seem to be able to find the scarce phosphorus. Often the hyphae of the fungi are also either embedded inside the root or at least touched on the outside, and they can feed some of that phosphorus into the plant. It's just absolutely amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think that's a signal to wrap it up then.
I just got warmed up, Chris.
Oh, like there are too many questions. We could keep going for hours. But we will be moving to a time of lunch now, and so I shouldn't invite people to bombard you, but maybe if you have specific questions, I suspect you'll be around for lunch, Tony?
Yes, thank you.
So please join me again in thanking Tony.